Okay, cool. So it's definitely being recorded this time. Hi guys and everybody that's not on the call. This is the second of what I hope to be many CCIE Security WebEx team study group meetings covering different topics related to directly either the CCIE security that we're all trying to attain or related to things that can help us achieve that certification indirectly. So this is one of those indirect, I would say, presentations today and demonstrations. And what I want to do is I want to go through how to build a CCIE security lab using VMware. Now, the reason I wanted to do this video was because I've had a few people reach out to me and mention as well in the actual WebEx Teams group that they would love to know how to put together a lab environment so that they can study for this certification. So because I've kind of done similar already, I thought it'd be worth kind of putting together this video so that hopefully you guys could pick up something from this and start to build up your own lab environment. So the agenda today is to go through the CCIE Security Lab equipment. So essentially what equipment and what the kit list is for the lab exam that we all at one point are going to take. I will then give you an overview of my lab environment as it stands at the moment. And then we will then jump into the demonstration and then we'll finish off with questions towards the end, as we always do. So the CCIE Security Lab equipment, there is quite a few of it. So I wanted to run through the equipment that we will be expected to know and at some point use either in the lab exam or before if we're not already using it. I've put a link to the equipment and software list at the bottom of the presentation here, which I will share in the group after this call. But what I wanted to really do is just quickly run through all of the equipment so that we can kind of look at what it is we could actually virtualize in our environment, in our lab environments, and what physical kit we may need to actually look to purchase if we wanted to make use of those. So quickly just running down the list, we have Cisco ISE. Now we're required to, or the lab itself will be based on ISE 2.4, which funnily enough is not the recommended version anymore. But nevertheless, ISE 2.4 is still a quite a I would say a recent software version to work with as opposed to the previous ones. Now this we can virtualize as it says there. So in terms of virtualization, you can run evaluations on, I believe, 8 gigabytes of RAM. And we'll discuss the RAM, etc., a little bit more in detail later. But as opposed to production environments where I think minimum is 6 gigabytes of RAM we need just for one node. So the good thing about this is, again, we can virtualize Cisco ISE, and in terms of the actual exam, I believe it's heavily focused on Cisco ISE. So if there's any piece of software or hardware you're going to get, make sure it's the ISE. With that, we can, for those that have not worked with ISE, we can either have a standalone node whereby we run the policy admin node, monitoring node, and the policy service nodes on one device, depending on the resources you've got. Or if you've got many resources, such as RAM and CPU, etc., that you can allocate in your lab environment, you can obviously build out a distributed deployment as you wish. So that's good. One thing I would say before I move on down this list is, make sure you have a Cisco account that you're capable of downloading this software. Evaluation licenses, which most if not all of these come with, you should be good to run all these on evaluation licenses in order to do your studies. So I wouldn't really worry about having full licenses for these. Again, the Cisco WSA or Web Security Appliance, we offer this virtual, so you can download this and make use of the evaluation license as well. The same with the email security appliance. Again, that's virtual. And all of these, like I say, if you're not running them in production environments, I believe most of them don't have checks on where you have to have a kind of minimum requirement of RAM running in order for it to run. So if you're running these in lab environments, you can get away with the bare minimum, which I would say is probably around 8 gig. The Cisco Firepower Management Center virtual, again, if you've got an account, you can download the FMC and get that spun up in your lab. And also you then got the Firepower Next Generation Firewall or Next Generation IPS, so FTD or IPS or IDS. Again, these are all virtual, so you can download them, and then you can also join them to the FMC. ASAV, I'm sure we're all aware that the ASAV is available and you can download that alongside the CSR 1000V, which I believe the CSR 1000V, I think we can take a look after, but I think I'm running it in my lab at the moment, and I'm using, I think, 4 gig of RAM. So again, you don't need to allocate that many resources to these. Stealth Watch, I believe that's a little bit more resource intensive, but again, we do offer this virtual, so you can also download that and get that in your lab. We've then got AMP or Fire AMP. Again, that's cloud version, so you may need an account for that. I'm not too sure. I do have an AMP account, so I can make use of that. But to be honest, I wouldn't really worry too much. If we look at the actual blueprint, there's not that much focus actually from what I've seen on AMP or things like Umbrella, etc. So that's not to say that there never is going to be a focus on that. I don't know. They may include that in future exams or questions, etc. So if you can get hold of that, then it's well worth having a look at that. Wireless LAN controllers. So we do offer a virtual wireless LAN controller that you can download. So that's well worth downloading if you can get hold of a physical wireless LAN controller. But what I would say is with that, I believe off the top of my head, there's certain things you can't do with a virtual wireless LAN controller that you can do with a physical wireless LAN controller. So things around guest access, if you're playing around with ICE guest access, etc. So if you can get hold of a physical wireless LAN controller, I would definitely recommend getting hold of one of those. And then we've got the Cisco DNA Center. Now this is it's under virtual appliance, but Cisco don't actually offer the Cisco DNA Center as a virtual appliance, so you can't go on to software.cisco.com and download that. It's not available like that. If you get hold of the image, you probably got it through TAC to rebuild a DNA appliance. There is resources out there where you can actually build a DNA center in VMware. Obviously, it's not supported by TAC, but you can do that. One thing I would say about that is it requires a lot of resources in order to run that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the RAM requirements alone is I think it's over 100 gig as far as I remember, if I'm right. So DNA Center is probably going to be one of those that a lot of us will not be able to lab and play with unless you've got access to an environment where you can actually do that, or if you access resources such as Cisco D Cloud. So I would probably say with DNA Center, have a look at Cisco D Cloud, Cisco live presentations, make sure you read the documentation where relevant, and if you can get any hands-on experience with that, it's definitely well worth it. Layer 2, iOS, virtual iOS software images. I'm sure pretty much all of us should have access to those now, or some form of virtual router or layer 2 image. So that's pretty much straightforward. And again, these images, you can run these on bare minimum RAM. Over to the physical equipment. We require physical equipment, or the kit list recommends physical equipment because there's certain things that you can't do with the virtual appliances as opposed to the physical appliances. So things like multi-context mode or clustering with ASAs, etc. So you do need to have the physical appliance for those. So if you can get hold of the 5512, I believe will be good enough to do some labbing with. That'll be good. If you're going to do that, maybe more than one firewall is probably recommended, so that you can do, you can do clustering if possible. But if not, you can still do, multi-context mode, etc. with the ASA if you've got one. Again, switches, so physical switches, so you've got the 3650 and the 3850. Both switches should be capable of doing things such as .1x. So that'll be for tying in with the identity service engine. So you can always run, you can always have a physical switch and tie it into your virtual lab. So your virtualized instance, and then do things such as .1x and MAB authentication, etc. So if you can get hold of any of those switches, again, that's very useful. You'll be able to do those stuff like that. Wireless access point, that ties in with the virtual wireless access point that's been published there. But again, as I said earlier, if you can get hold of a physical wireless LAN controller and a wireless access point, I personally think that will be better than just playing around with a virtual wireless access point.
Are you eating now? If you're eating now, yeah.
If you're not talking, can you just go on mute, please?
Sorry.
No problem, thank you. And then last of all, we've got a classification over. So, we've got a test PC and recommended is Windows 10. We've got a Active Directory or domain server. So they're recommending Windows Server 2016. And then we've got Kali Linux and AnyConnect. So where do they fall in? So I guess the Windows 10, it's always good to have a test machine anyway, but with that, again, you'll be able to do things like .1x authentication, things like that. The AnyConnect module can tie into that Windows test machine, so you could probably do authentication, VPN authentication using Cisco ICE, things like that. So it's always good to make sure that you don't just forget about the other things. If you can get hold of them, then do so. So with that said, the overview of my lab, I wanted to put together my lab environment to give me the best possible chance in order of passing the CCIE Security exam. We all know that reading about these different technologies is not good enough. We need to make sure that we've got hands-on experience with these technologies, and especially if we're in the field, we need to make sure that we have an environment where we can go and test things and break things without being on a customer's production network. So for me, I thought it was very relevant in order to get the following equipment for my lab environment. So I started off first with a HP Mini Tower. It's an Intel server, and that had 16 gigabytes of RAM and 2.5 terabytes of storage. This pretty much was taken up by a Microsoft server that I was running and didn't leave really any room for me to do anything else with it. And we'll take a look at my topology after. So what I did then is I went out and I purchased a tower server, and part of the reason why I purchased a tower server was because I didn't really have rack space to rack another server that you could put into a rack. So I went and purchased a tower server. It's an Intel Xeon Core server with 32 cores in total, 132 gigs of RAM and 5 terabytes of storage. It sounds like a lot, but when you start to build the equipment list that we just spoke about here, you will quickly realize that you start to consume all those resources, especially the RAM, because a lot of these can be RAM intensive. Aside from that, I also have some physical equipment. So I have an ICE 3595 appliance, a UCS server, pretty much. I have a physical wireless LAN controller. I've got a couple of access points. I've got a firepower appliance. I've got a few ASAs. So I think I've got some 5512s and ASA 5506s. And I've got various switches that are capable of doing things like .1x and MACsec, etc. And I have a few other physical pieces of kit that I play with from time to time. So the reason I'm kind of giving you an overview of kind of what I've got at the minute is because these are the sort of things that you need to, if you're looking at really getting a lab environment set up in order to give yourself the best chance of passing this exam. It's worth kind of investing that time and money into setting it up properly, and also it'll serve you beyond the CCIE. You can do many more things with these virtual lab environments and the physical kit as well. Excuse me. So this is pretty much a work in progress, but this is my lab and physical topology as it stands at the moment. Where highlighted in red, so we've got the VLAN 200, etc. This is what we're going to work on in demonstration today, just kind of spinning up a new site, if you like, just to kind of show you how it's done within VMware. But what I've tried to do for my lab environment, and this is just by the way, this is not a set way of doing it. You may find when you build out your lab environment, you want to do things different, and that's totally fine. What I wanted to do in my lab environment is I wanted to kind of try cover every area that is going to be required in the CCIE Security Lab exam. So, for instance, I have a pair of FTDs in HA here, and then on the left side, I've got a pair of ASAs which are in HA here. And then I've kind of sectioned them off into different sites. So now I've kind of got like a management tier at the top where things like my FMC sit. I've got my umbrella virtual appliances, Cisco Prime. I've got ICE in both tiers, and then I've got Stealth Watch, ESA, etc. In there as well. So what I wanted to try to do is I wanted to make it as realistic as possible, but at the same time be able to utilize as many features as I can. So again, like with the CSR, which is sat down here, so CSR 005, this is actually running a zone-based firewall, as opposed to an ASA or an FTD. And then I've got a different environment within that, which I call a penetration lab, penetration testing lab. Which has got Metasploits and Kali Linux in there. So things like this would then, in hindsight, looking at this topology, would have to run through the WSA. Then I've got a separate ICE standalone instance here, separate server here, and I've got the Stealth Watch flow sensor, UDP director. So the way I've built out my lab is to try, like I say, utilize as many features as possible with these different types of technologies. It's by no way of means finished yet, but I do feel like I've got a good starting point and a point where I'm at a point where I can modify this environment very easily and quickly as to what I need to do. So speaking of physical equipment and virtual equipment, if we look at the bottom side here, I actually tied in my physical equipment with the virtual environment. So what we've got here is we've pretty much got an interface that connects into the virtual environment. And then I've got my physical environment. So I've got a distribution switch, I've got access switches, which is secured by my physical 2100, my Firepower 2100, which then connects into my virtual environment. And then I've got my ICE physical appliance, and then my WLC, a separate server, which is running virtually. And all this is, like I say, physical, whereby I can connect, .1x physical clients. So I've got some phones, and then I've also got an endpoint where I can actually connect a virtual Windows 10 machine and perform .1x authentication doing that, and all that can tie into my physical, my virtual infrastructure. So I wanted to point that out because if you've already got physical equipment, it's always, even if you want to transition to a virtual environment, it's always worth keeping that physical equipment and seeing how best you can utilize that equipment in with your virtual environment rather than just getting rid of it. And then aside from that, the way I've set up my environment is I can access this virtually. So if I'm not physically located there, I have a VPN tunnel where I can access this lab virtually. So it's always good because it's pretty much on demand. When I need it, it's there. And then last of all, I've kind of got AMP in the cloud, as mentioned before. I've got Cisco Umbrella, etc. running there. So this is pretty much how I put my lab together, and the way I pretty much did it is I started from the top. So when I say the top, I started from, let's say, my FTD here and the management layer, so with my FMC, etc., and I worked my way down. So I devised a kind of base topology, which this is the base, and it's kind of changed over time. And I started to come up with an IP address scheme for what I was going to use for the different sites, and then also how how I could make sure the whole lab environment could be reachable. So I decided to use dynamic routing. So if you can see here, I've got the backbone OSPF running, and then I've got different areas. So each site represents a different area. So you've got area 2, area 3, area 4, and so on. And they're just tying to OSPF. So at the end, every time I spin up a new site, the new areas or the new networks that are kind of spun up, they're learned by the whole environment, so they're reachable wherever I need them from. So that's a kind of good thing that I kind of came up with. So it's well worth doing that. And yeah, that's pretty much it with how I kind of come up with my lab. And then last of all, one thing I decided when I started to build this lab environment was I wanted a more permanent infrastructure. So what you see here is a more permanent infrastructure. Things are not really going to change on a day-to-day basis, like the FTD, etc. But I also wanted an environment where I could, spin up labs or proof of concepts and tear them down, or just quickly test something. So what I did is I actually within the virtual environment I created a EVE-NG instance, so another virtual environment within the virtual environment. So what happens here is I've actually got access via my environment into EVE-NG, and then I've allocated some resources to EVE-NG, and I can run quick labs on there. Basically, I call them quick proof of concepts, and then I tear them down, sort of thing. And it doesn't affect my overall topology that I've got running here. So that's one thing that I believe is useful if you're actually going to go down this route. So how did I put all this together? I'll just start off by saying, you know, I'm not a virtual or VMware expert. Means pretty much everything that I've done has been you know, kind of on the go and research as I've been kind of building out my environment. So, you know, there may be other ways and better ways to do what I've done within VMware, but I wanted to kind of show you today how I've put together my environment and kind of what works for me, because it also might work for you. So we'll jump into the demonstration now, and a couple of things that I really want to show working is, you know, how we kind of link the virtual environment to the internet, because that's an important thing if you want to, you know, get updates, etc. How to create the new networks and link them using the vSwitches in VMware. And then we'll look at the dynamic routing element that I spoke about, how we actually tie in those new networks to the rest of the environment and how they're learned. And then, you know, we'll just finish off by speaking about a few lab considerations. So I'll just get up my virtual environment now. So if I just stop sharing that, then let me just get onto my VMware. Just give me a second. Okay, so let me share screen. Okay, cool. So this is my lab VMware ESXi that's running at the moment. So just take a quick look here. So as I say, you know, at the minute I've got 47 virtual machines. You can see that at the minute I've got 93% of my RAM is being used. Storage, I've got 5 terabytes, which is I think they're running in a RAID 3, if I can remember correctly off the top of my head. So I lose a terabyte, so it's only showing, you know, approximately 4 terabytes. But that's enough for what I need at the minute. The CPU is only on 22%. So out of all my virtual machines, I have, see how many are powered on. So I've got 23 of those powered on at the minute. A lot of them are ASAs, CSRs, the EVE-NG environment that we spoke of, FTDs, Kali Linux, etc. So a lot of those are powered on, and they've got different usage requirements, obviously. So if we now look back at the topologies, so if I just zoom in here, this is what I used to build it on Dryo. So what we need to do is what I want to do is I want to demonstrate how you can build these different sites that I've built here, and it's pretty simple using the vSwitches, etc. You kind of use that as a template to start your lab and build it out from there, you know, top to bottom or however you want to do it. So I've pretty much put a new site here, so site 5, and then we've got CSRV connecting up to another CSR, which is already configured. So what we're going to do is we'll configure this CSR 009 element, and we'll see how it all ties in. So just quickly looking at the networking elements within the VMware, we've got virtual switches and then we've got port groups. I'm not going to go through explaining about all that, but there's different ways to set these up, but the way that I've done it works for me. So how I tend to do it is when I create a new site, I create a new vSwitch, so a new virtual switch here, and then I'll create a port group that ties into linking the two devices or the devices together. So for instance, what we're going to do is here with CSR 003 and CSR 009, we'll create a new vSwitch here. So essentially, this is a new network, and this will become its own separate network essentially. And then for this side, we'll put an interface into another vSwitch, and then we'll connect this to essentially a VLAN. That's essentially what we do. So if we look at CSR3, let me just get this up again. So it's pretty much got the basic config on it, but we should have one interface left. So we've got gig 6 there. So what we'll do first is we'll create like I said, we'll create another vSwitch for it. So if I just create this, we'll call it demo. And we can leave all the rest of the settings as standard. We don't really need to mess with them. And then if I head to port groups, I'll create a new port group for it. And what I try to do with the naming, my naming convention, to be fair, is a little bit all over the place, but I try to make sure it describes both of the devices that I connect into. So for instance, we'll call this one CSR 009 to CSR 003. And then with a VLAN ID, the vSwitches and the port groups work different as opposed to how you configure VLANs on normal switches. So to turn this into a trunk, you essentially assign it a VLAN of 4095, and that turns that port group into a trunk. If you want to assign it a VLAN, obviously you just give it a VLAN, whatever it may be, and 0 is whereby the actual, I believe it's the actual device itself that connects to the port group actually does the VLAN tagging. So there's different ways to tag VLANs if you're using VLANs. With this one, we're not going to use any VLAN. We'll just give it IPs on the physical interfaces. Security, we can leave it the same. We don't really need to mess with those for these interfaces. We'll just OK that. And then the last one that we need to create is a port group for, I like to create port groups for the actual, again, if we go back to the topology. So for the actual site, I like to create separate port groups for them as well to tie them into a VLAN essentially. So again, I'm just going to give this one a name of site 6. And then I'll add a port group and we'll give this a VLAN as the topology we said we was going to do, which was VLAN 200. So we'll give it a name. So we'll just call it demo site, VLAN 200, and this connects to site 6 vSwitch. And essentially now all we need to do is we need to tie these interfaces up to the right vSwitches, to the right groups for it to work. So what we'll do first is we'll start off with CSR3, which we've got up here. So we'll use Gigabit Ethernet 6 for that. So what we'll do first is we'll configure the IP address for this 6, and I think I give a mask already. So 12.0.0.69 we'll use. And it's a /30. Link to site 6, we'll call it. So we've got that interface there up now. So what we need to do now with CSR3, we need to make sure that that interface ties into the right vSwitch. So we'll go back to our ESXi environment, and then we'll go to the virtual machine, which is here. And we can see that we've got, it's actually assigned to a port group called unused at the minute. So what we'll do is we'll edit that. Refresh it, because sometimes does that. So again, we'll edit that. And then we'll go down to the network adapter 6. And then what we're doing with this is we're actually assigning it to, so we go back to the topology. We're going to assign it to the site that we made. So let's scroll down to, let's start from the top. As you can see, I've got quite a few here. So there we go. So we've got CSR 009 to CSR 003. So we'll assign it to that port group. We'll save that. And then what we'll do now with CSR 009, we're going to have to configure it on here because it's a fresh install. There's nothing on it. What we'll do with this is we'll actually assign to probably gig 1. Let's just check the interfaces quickly. So it's actually got a config on. So for this instance, actually, we'll use gig 2. Maybe do some work on this. So interface gig 2, and the IP address we'll give, because we gave CSR 00369, and there's two usable in the range, we'll give the CSR 009 120078. 252. Shut. And so that's gig 2. So what we need to do again on the actual interface of the VM, we now need to assign that to the same one as we did with the CSR 03. There's this port group, so CSR 009 to CSR 003. And that's connected. And to be honest, normally when I do this, I make sure the devices are powered off first, because sometimes I've found that it can play with your interfaces in terms of when you assign new port groups when the device turned on. Sometimes it doesn't work, but we could try it. So if we do ping 120069, so we can see there that we've got a successful ping now. But if we do IP route, we've got some other routes on there actually, which I'm going to have to take off for this demonstration. In fact, they should take over, but just double check what I've got going on here. So interface gig 1, I'm just going to shut it down for now because we don't need that. Okay. All right, we're good. So we can see now that we've only got the locally connected, directly connected subnet that we've configured. So for the next part, we now need to, well, there's two things we need to do. So we need to make sure that this new network's advertised by CSR3. So we're going to have to configure OSPF on both of these devices. So this is area 6. So what we'll do, in fact, we'll do that first. And I hope you can see this actually, by the way. I understand it might be a bit small. but I've only got access to this device actually by the ESXi client at the moment. So we'll just do router OSPF 1, and then we're going to add the network, so 12.0.0, it was 68. And we'll do 0.0.0.0.3, and it was area 6. Yep, area 5. Okay, so now we've added that to OSPF on CSR, but let's rename this. Let's name CSR 009. Okay, now we'll now configure OSPF on CSR 03, which is configured with all the other networks. So if we do show IP route, we can see that we've got a lot of routes going on here at the minute. So what we'll do now is we'll configure the new network that we've just created. So we'll do network 12.0.0.68 3, and it's area 5. We should see the adjacency change. Hopefully. Oh, we didn't see it change, but anyhow, we've got all the routes now, so the adjacency has been formed there, as you can see. We'll just take a look now at the CSR 3. We've got the directly connected as well, obviously, which is going to be in there, so that's fine. So now is we've created that as that link establishment using the V switches and the port groups with CSR. Keep referring to 5, but with CSR 009 and CSR 003. So that has now give us, now that we've advertised the new network, this has now give us access pretty much within all the environment for whatever you want to spin up within this site. So what we'll do then is we created another port group for VLAN 200. So we'll assign a device to that now. And I think I've got, let's use this host, so Kali 002, so Kali Linux host. So it's already assigned to a VLAN, but let me change it. So we'll change it to the one that we created. Called demo site, I believe it was. And then what we also need to do is we need to configure the other interface on the CSR. So we'll configure on the CSR 09. So we need to configure this inside interface, which is going to connect that Kali Linux host as a default gateway. So we'll quickly do that now. Again, I'll have to reload. That seems like a bug, by the way. It comes up like that. Okay, so we'll make use of the third interface by assigning it to that demo site, which is VLAN 200, I believe. And just to make sure, actually, we need to make sure that that is trunking. In fact, no, we don't. It needs to be VLAN 200. We don't need to trunk it. So let me just make sure. Yep, so we've got VLAN 200 assigned to that, which is good. So now we'll configure that interface. I think I gave it an IP address. So we're going to use 192.168.200.0/24. So interface gig 3, IP address 192.168.200.10 we'll give it. It's a /24. We'll do no shut. It's fine. So we've got gateway. Okay, so what we'll do now, in fact, yeah, we'll leave that as 10. We'll assign the Kali host as 20.20. So now we'll go on to the Kali Linux source. We'll just fire this up quickly. We'll just do a live boot. Just wait for that to boot. And while that's booting, I am trying to rush through it given the time, but if there's any questions that we can't cover on the call, just reach out on the CCIE security group, and I'll do my best to answer them. So we'll just wait now for this Kali host to boot up. We've already put it in the correct port group. If we actually look on the port groups, we should be able to see, go down to demo site. We can see here that we've got two ports, if you like, that are connected to that port group demo site. So we've got the inside interface, if you like, of CSR v009 and Kali 002, which is what we're going to configure now. So we'll just configure this quickly. Modify that. IPv4, so we'll do manual. So we'll give an IP address of 192.168.200.20. Oops, I don't know what's going on there. 200.20. And a gateway of 192.168.200.10, which is the CSR interface that we configured. So we'll apply that. I'm not going to apply DNS because I've got, if we take a look at the topology, I've got firewalls configured, so I'd need to add rules for this network, etc. So I'm not going to do that. But if the rules were added, this environment would essentially have access to the internet, etc. So that's something that you can kind of build into your environment. So now on this Kali host, we should technically be able to ping 192.168.200.10. 192.168.200.10. That doesn't look, did work. Is it just coming up? Let me try again. There we go. So the network, it just took some time there. So we can see there now that we can ping that network. So lastly, what we'd want to do is if we wanted this network to have access to the internet, so we've configured this Kali host now into site 5, into here. So we've got this host is now sat in here and it's connecting to CSR 009. Now, if we want the rest of the network to know about this environment or this new site, we do need to advertise that into OSPF as well. So we do that on the CSR 009. And just to kind of show you quickly that we don't know about that network, let's say on the ASA up here, we'll quickly log into that ASA. We'll just do a show route. In fact, we'll do a, because I've got loads of routes, show route for 192.168.200.0. We can see there that the network's not in the table. So now if we configure, let's go back to this. Let's say, for instance, we wanted to reach this 200.0 network from the rest of the environment. If we go back to our CSR now and we configure this into OSPF, router OSPF 1, network 192.168.200.0.255. It was area 5. So now we've configured that. Now let's go back to the ASA. You can see that network now. There we go. So now that network is visible to the rest of the network. So we can see 8 seconds ago that was learned. So now we've got access essentially from the rest of the environment, wherever it may be, because everything else is tied into OSPF. So what we've done there is we've spun up a new environment, or a new site as I call it, just using vSwitches and port groups. And that's essentially how you can build out your VMware network and have different sites and different connectivity to different elements of the network. If we just fly back now to the, yep, so we covered linking the virtual network to the internet. I mean, we didn't show you the internet connectivity because I've got the firewall rules in place, so I'd need to add rules, and we don't have time for that. We went over looking at creating the networks using the vSwitches and the port groups. We've just covered the dynamic routing, so how we can actually tie in those new networks to the rest of the environment and to the physical environment if you want. It's all learned with the dynamic routing if that's the way you want to go. You don't have to configure OSPF. You could use the IGRP or BGP, whatever you want to use. It's totally up to you. Other lab considerations, I would say, just make sure that you are trying to utilize as many of the technologies as you can when you're building out your environment. Try to make it as realistic as possible. And don't be afraid of breaking things, because essentially it's your lab environment. That's what it's there for. Given the time, I'm probably not going to cover any more on that. But I hope that has been useful for everybody on the call, and for those that are not on the call but going to watch this with the replay. We've got 5 minutes, so I don't know if you guys want to cover any questions that you may have on the call now. If not, feel free to post them in the group at a later stage.
The only question I have is, you had your PC specs up at some point, and I just want to know what's the speed of your CPU.
So the CPU. So if we look at the CPU, we'll actually go onto the ESXi host. So we've got 2.9 gigahertz. So we've got 16 CPUs, but we've got 2 Intel Xeon Core processors. So we've actually got 32 cores running at 2.9 gigahertz. So since I've been running this environment, I've not had any problems with the CPU or it running slow. As I said at the start of the call, the main thing with running these lab environments is essentially the RAM usage, because most of these devices are memory intensive, so you do find that you do allocate quite a few resources to some of these devices. One thing that I would point out as well is, depending on how you build out your environment, you may want to allocate more resources to certain devices. So for instance, the FTD up here, this is running a SSL VPN, as well as intrusion prevention. You've got a couple of other things on there. So this has actually got more resources allocated than, let's say, the HA pair that's running down here. So it all depends on kind of how you kind of want to run your environment. But I feel like these specs that I have here, I kind of worked out what I wanted to achieve before I actually purchased the server. And this right now works for me. Of course, I'd like more memory, but with more memory comes more cost. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, man. Yes, thank you.
No worries.
Hello, everyone. This is not a question, but a comment regarding the versions.
Yeah.
So I'm just putting on the chat the site to download WSA versions. It might be the case that the version that it's that is going to be used on the lab is not available on. I've talked to some colleagues that took the version 5, and they mentioned that probably if you want to set up your own lab with the same version that that is going to be used on the lab, those versions are not available. However, the advice for me is just pick the next one. For example, on the lab and the WSA in a specific, it's put it 9.2. If 9.2 is not available, it's 10 is the next one, and it's the closest one for the 9.2. So don't be afraid to download it. And most of the menus change too much, and the functionalities are pretty much the same. So it's just a heads up for you.
Good, thank you, Emmanuel. That's a very good point, actually. One thing that I've realized with the versions is, in my lab environment, for instance, I'm running, firepower on 6.5, and 6.2 is it's getting old now, in my opinion. So I'm actually running 6.5. There's a few changes, but as Emmanuel said, if the next version up or the next couple of versions up hasn't got really any changes in terms of the graphical user interface or features have changed, then don't be afraid of using the next version up or the next couple of versions up. So yeah, thank you for that, Emmanuel. That's a good point. That's a good call out.
No worries.
Cool. Well, we're on top of the hour, guys. So if anybody's got any more questions, again, please just drop them in the chat section on the Teams group. But I hope you found this session useful today, and we'll be doing some more in the future. So until then, guys, thanks a lot for participating today.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.